in this room have helped on that for a long time and are helping on that now. Thank you for what you do. The whole focus of both campaigns and public policy and placing leaders there that Mort Blackwell has brought attention to like no other conservative leader has made a big difference and will continue to. And Helen and I are the co-chairman of the Mort Blackwell fan club, so I'm glad to be here with them. I'm going to talk a little bit about energy. Before I do that, I'm going to tell you a story. I told our members the other day. We were getting into this whole complicated issue of what needs to happen vis-a-vis the economy, and obviously it's not a situation we feel like we created or want to be in right now, but I see this is kind of like the supposedly true story of the golf course 110 or 20 years ago that the occupying British Army was building in a remote, other peaceful, not very exciting part of India. And there wasn't much going on, so the occupiers, this golf course, the focus on this golf course had been significant. And finally, after a couple of years of work, they'd carved this golf course out of the jungle. And from the moment the first golf ball was hit, they had a problem that they hadn't anticipated. The monkeys would run out of the jungle and grab your golf ball. And, you know, your golf ball might be in the fairway and the monkey would throw it in the rough. Or your golf ball might be in the rough and the monkey would throw it in the fairway. Or the monkey may throw the ball back at you. And so after weeks of trying to, every way they could think of to get rid of the monkeys, trapping the monkeys, taking them other places, shooting cannons to see if that would just permanently scare the monkeys away, weeks of unsuccessful effort, and the monkeys are still there. They finally came up with a rule for this golf course, and perhaps this golf course only, that was the rule for the golf course, which was you have to play the ball where the monkey throws it. And you don't always have a chance, you don't always have much of a choice as to where that's going to be or particularly advantaged by it. Let me talk about two topics. One, a topic that Mort and I have talked about for months now, and that's energy. And that I intended for that to be my topic today when Mort and I talked about coming over. And then two, I'll try to bring you up to date on where we are on this financial workout situation that was poorly discussed and labeled from day one. But I'll talk about that when I get there. Energy, which I'd love to talk about for the rest of the time we're here, and I wish the country was still focused on it, turned out to be a great issue for us because it was one of the defining issues in the decade that I've been in the Congress between us and them. You know, in the 10 years I was in the majority in the Congress, my first 10 years here, we actually ran a specific vote-by-vote tally on this, and 87% of the Republicans voted for more energy supply 100% of the time. You know, 90%, going to round it off in your mind, 90% of the Republicans were always for more supply. And 86% of the Democrats were always for less supply. Always. It was a huge difference in us or them. And finally, the politics of less supply have caught up with the economy of the country. You know, every other country in the world looks at its natural resources and thinks economic advantage. We have looked at our natural resources for too long and thought environmental hazard, to the point that we're the only country in the world, for instance, that can drill in the deep water that doesn't do it. We're the only country, again, let me repeat that, in the world who has gas and oil resources in deep water that hasn't chosen to go after them. And that's, again, that's that environmental hazard group rather than economic advantage group. And we're paying the price for that. And our members, I told our members May the 1st, I said, look, we ought to be talking about nothing but energy and gasoline, except on that rare occasion when the Democrats might bring something to the floor that really mattered. Hadn't happened many times in this Congress. You know, we've named more post offices and passed less legislation than any Congress ever. Now, we've passed lots of legislation out of the House, almost all of which I voted against, but none of it ever became law. It was the 56 votes to micromanage the war in Iraq, 56 of those, the 26 votes to raise taxes, those all passed. I voted against every one of them. None of them became law because I guess maybe they weren't even intending to make law. They were just trying to talk about politics. We've named more public buildings than any Congress ever. Of the bills that did pass, I think the president's only signed something like 256 bills into law for this entire Congress. 74 of them named public buildings. Half of the other half everybody voted for, so that was obviously not a very controversial thing. And then you've got those extensions. So this Congress wasn't working. It's okay, unless they bring something to the floor. And I actually gave 2 examples that day, both of which we eventually forced on the floor. Unless they bring the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to the floor, and if they do, we'll debate that. Or if they bring the supplemental appropriations bill to support the troops, we'll debate and defend that. But if it's a bill that doesn't matter, let's talk about energy. And let's just defy the chair to say your discussions are not germane to the topics of the day. And in fact, I even put a little chart together that had the increased prices of gas and what Congress voted on that day. And it kind of culminates on June 17th when the national average for gasoline was $4.14. We passed the Monkey Safety Act that day. This was the act that made it illegal to take non-human primates, this is actually in the law, non-human primates across state lines for commercial purposes. That's what we did that day. And that was very indicative of what, by the way, I voted against that. That was very indicative of what we did the entire chart. And I said, if we can, let's keep this up to Memorial Day and see where we were. And we never got our members more focused on a message because it was what the American people were talking about. And by Memorial Day, I was able to say, look, for the first time in 2 years, we've got people listening to us again. And that means you can't stop talking about what they're listening to. And so we need to keep that up, and we pretty well kept that up right until the last few days. And it was working, and in many ways still is working. We brought the generic Democrat-Republican congressional ballot to virtually even. In fact, a few days ago, we were ahead among likely voters in the generic. And it's the first time we've been ahead in the generic ballot for 3 years. That was before a week ago last Thursday. I'm not sure where we are now, but I'm sure that nothing has happened since then that benefited us. This whole discussion of how bad a shape the economy's in has been a harmful discussion for us. There's no question about that. But it doesn't mean it's not a real discussion. When Secretary Paulson came up a week ago Thursday night, and we got the leaders of the bipartisan leaders together with the bipartisan committee leaders in the affected committee, and he started talking about what he thought had to be done. And I told him that night, I said, if we're talking, if we got to use different terms than we're starting to use. As long as you're talking about bailout, Wall Street, and illiquid assets, you're frankly talking to almost nobody that I work for or nobody that our members work for, and that won't work. Unfortunately, once you get started down that communication road, it's hard to start back the other way. And while we were able to get a bill to take to the floor this week that was much better than the initial proposal in terms of a huge effort to have a private sector alternative of insurance out there as part of the plan, and an almost virtual guarantee that taxpayers would never lose any money, and I can explain that to you, and I guess I probably should. We were still talking about bailout for Wall Street. 90% of the calls that my colleagues were getting, at least my Republican colleagues were getting, was don't do this. It was don't bail out these guys on Wall Street. They ought to go to jail, not get taxpayer dollars. There are probably even a few people who called my office who thought I should go to jail for some reason that I didn't agree with. But the intensity was incredibly high on the don't do what you're talking about doing. And to make it even worse, we were not even trying to do what they thought we were talking about doing. But I think that's more our fault than anybody else's, that you know, the administration communicated poorly from day one the real goal here. Now, there are clearly liquidity problems in the country. And we've seen a series of things happen that would indicate that. Not many local bankers have felt that yet. Some have, more beginning to now than were a few days ago. And for this to be a reasonable thing for the people that at least Republican members work for, it has to have some Main Street consequences. And if you've gone to get a home loan lately, or you've tried to expand your service station lately, or you've tried to put in the new Dunkin' Donuts shop lately, you actually are among the few people that know that it is having consequence. You know, when McDonald's notifies their franchisees, which frankly are the richest people most of my colleagues and I know, that your normal line, don't no longer count on your normal line of credit from Bank of America because it's not there. For your new restaurant, the expansion of your restaurant, or even the money you were counting on to put this new line of coffee products in, you can't count on the line of credit that every McDonald's franchisee has always had some access to before. That's pretty significant. When you have all these European banks in big trouble, something is obviously happening, and something needs to be done, and in all likelihood, it will wind up being something that nobody in this room, including me, would have ever wanted to do on their own if they could do something on their own to solve this problem. So, we voted on a bill the other day. Republican members were not there in the numbers they needed to be. The Democrats are the majority. They have an extraordinary obligation in the majority to do more of the hard work than the minority does, because they get to decide what to bring to the floor, when to bring it to the floor, how to bring it to the floor. But for whatever reason, we were about 12 votes short. And you know, stock market did what it did on Monday. Some of that came back yesterday. There may be even a little more back today. But also on Monday, Wachovia, which I think had been at $55 a share a year ago, sold for $1 a share. $1 a share. Over the weekend, European banks, 4 of them, were taken over in one way or another by the collective governments in Europe to try to keep those banks stable. Now, calls have changed. 3 things have happened since Monday that will have impact on our members. One is the calls have changed, and changed pretty dramatically. From don't do this to what are you doing? You know, my IRA just went to nothing. I'm concerned about my pension plan. The article that my wife read me yesterday out of one of the papers she was reading was a guy who said, well, I'm retired. My resources have now gone down 30% in the last 3 weeks. I've just got to figure out how to die 30% sooner than I intended to early. You know, that's sort of where the country is. So, okay, so the calls have changed. We have added an element that I proposed as the House negotiator to add over the weekend, which was let's do something about FDIC to keep money in banks. Both Senator Obama and Senator McCain have agreed that doubling, a little more than doubling the insured amount would be the right thing to do. So the Senate will put that in the bill today. And the third thing that's changed is that Chairman Cox has exercised some authority he's had all the time, which is to significantly modify the way some assets have to be evaluated on a daily basis. In a post-Enron environment, the accounting standards changed to where you had to evaluate based on that day's market every asset you had. It's the so-called mark-to-market rule. And if people are so afraid of securitized mortgages, for instance, that nobody wants to buy them, you were writing down every day 0 or 10 or whatever it was, 10%, 0, and then you'd have to take the money that otherwise would have been available for your other operations, like loaning it to the guy that's putting in the Dunkin' Donut shop. You'd have to take that and shove it back over to the, okay, here's how we're securing this asset that we had thought was worth X that's now worth 0 or worth 1/10 of X. So that helps. And the Senate today will take the extension of current tax policies for research and development, alternative energy, holding people harmless from the alternative minimum tax, the extension of those policies without any new taxes to offset them, which I'm for, extending good tax policy. They'll take that big bill that almost every Republican would be for by itself, put the compromise that we work for, which took the bad bankruptcy language, the bad labor union language, the bad ACORN language out of the bill, take that and put the FDIC insurance on it. They will pass that bill today. And then we'll just see. That'll cost some Democrats, because Democrats would like to, they don't want to have that tax package without raising taxes. That'll cost some Democrats. We'll just have to evaluate today whether it gets enough additional Republicans in addition to the ones we would have needed to add on, that I frankly think the FDIC and the mark-to-market change probably would have gotten anyway, and you get enough additional Republicans to offset whatever Democrats you now lose, and hopefully by the end of the week have passed a piece of legislation that won't solve all the economic problems, but is better than the moment we're in right now. And so I think with that, I'll try to answer questions. Thank you all. You want me to handle, just decide how to do these, Morton?
Let me start off with a question.
Okay.
Everything that you've mentioned that is being changed seems like a change for the better from our conservative standpoint.
Right.
Are not the Democrat leaders in the Congress trying to advance more rotten things like the ACORN subsidy and goodies for labor unions, et cetera? Is it possible that the bill is going to just improve?
Well, the question is, obviously, is it possible the bill will just improve? There are basically about 3 alternatives here for that could happen. One is we can advance a more pro-growth oriented piece of legislation that frankly won't pass. We are not in the majority. No, it's just not going to pass. But we can advance that. And of course, the counter proposal when you do that is the Democrats then have to go back to aggressively where they were. So they would put back in the money for ACORN. They would maybe put in some kind of mandatory tax on all financial institutions because this is a chance to do that. They would put back in the so-called cram-down provisions, which means a bankruptcy judge can renegotiate the terms of any loan. And if anybody here thinks that makes it easier for you to get a loan in the future, no matter how good your credit is, you're wrong. Because a banker will not loan money at today's best rate if he knows that a bankruptcy judge can come back in at some time in the future and move that down. They can put back in labor union representatives in the boardroom for any company that reaches out and takes advantage of this workout provision and try to pass it with Democrat votes, and they can hope that the pressure then is so great on the president from the economy that he just has to sign whatever it is, and they would probably be right. So we don't want that to happen. And if we have to act quickly, in my view, if we get a bill that only improves. And again, negotiating this over the weekend, I had FDIC out there as an issue. We put some mark-to-market language in that would require a quick 45-day study, and restate our intent that the Securities and Exchange Commissioner respond to that study. But he's gotten ahead of us in a good way, so that helps. And the other thing that this does, this is really a workout, not a bailout. And all of us that are going to, at least people like me who believe this is now what has to happen with good changes, have to explain it that way. This is where the government goes in, and by the way, there's more transparency and more oversight in this particular piece of legislation than anything ever. This now, it didn't include anything the day Secretary Paulson sent it up. It's 2.5 pages. Give me the money. I'll spend it wisely, and that's how this is going to go. It's got a special inspector general. It's got special government accounting obligations. It's got a committee of the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the chairman of the SEC, the Secretary of Treasury, and the Secretary of Commerce that have to determine overall policy. And the goal would be not that you go in and buy assets for what some bank or some Wall Street person has in them, but you go in and establish a true floor. Now, if you establish a true floor, you can't possibly lose money if you're smart enough to know where the true floor is. You know, if you buy right, you always make money. And that would be the element here. You'd establish a true floor that hopefully then begins to have private sector coming in and saying, well, you know, if the government's willing to give 45% of the face value of these securitized mortgages, maybe I can make money by giving 47 or 46. And that's what you'd hope to do. But if the government does buy something at 45% of its face value, the big advantage that the government has is, one, you have low cost of money. Two, you have all the time in the world and all the patience in the world. And if you have that, this works out to where taxpayers probably make money, just like they probably will make money on the AIG intervention. It's almost impossible for taxpayers to lose the way that was put together. They probably make money, and if they don't, we put a provision in over the weekend that says after 5 years, the president has to look at the OMB director. The OMB director certifies the president whether taxpayers are likely to lose money, and if they are, the president has to propose to the Congress a way that the participating groups that participate in the program can, over whatever period of time necessary, make up for that loss. So only if a future Congress fails to do its job is it even possible to lose money here. And I think it's unlikely to lose money if you've got enough of a focus on what the real value is. I told our members the other day, they said, well, you know, that means the government winds up buying a lot of, they would use in different terms, junk, trash, whatever. I said, use whatever term you want, but a lot of people make a lot of money buying those exact same kinds of things. You know, the guy that runs the salvage yard doesn't stay in business unless he buys at the right level and makes money. And what looks like a junk car to me, and I could do nothing with it, it would actually be a cost and an obligation to me, to the salvage yard guy. He knows, okay, if I give $150 for this junk car, it's got $300 worth of retrievable things in it, and I'm going to make $150. You know, if I gave $150 for the junk car, I'd then have to pay somebody to haul the junk car off, so I'd like lose $100. And so you've got to look at it that way, and you know, you have time, you have patience, and more importantly, we're just in a situation where, starting with President Clinton and right through the Bush administration, government policy encouraged and almost required lenders to loan money to people who had less chance to pay it back than anybody they'd ever loaned money to before. And all of us, even most of us Republicans, and certainly me, I can remember saying, look, home ownership is at an all-time high. Home ownership in the minority community is at an all-time high. You know, and we all said that, and now you look back and think it got there too aggressively. And we've got to now do something about that prior to coming up with a regulatory environment that makes sense today rather than a regulatory environment that made sense 30 years ago. You've got a lot of worldwide economic interaction now that you didn't have even 10 years ago. And what happens in Belgium today affects what happens in Springfield, Missouri 4 days from now. That would not have been the case a decade ago. It just wouldn't have been. And so we're trying to work through it now. My other answers are much shorter. I'm going to do shorter answers. And then we're coming to you next.
How do we turn around the erroneous perception?
Okay.
How do we turn around the erroneous perception that the Republicans are totally responsible for this financial crisis when really the opposite is true? And it's certainly hurting us in the polls. I recall that McCain was ahead there until this hit, and now he's behind about 5 or 6 points.
Right. Well, you all heard the question. The best way to turn around this is just to get beyond it, to tell you the truth. Get this solved. Hopefully things will stabilize enough that while there'll still be some bumpy moments, that people are no longer talking about this and get back to the issues that matter to us. Frankly, I think there's plenty of blame to go around here. And Republicans share in some of it. It's not all our fault, but some of it is our fault. So we need to stabilize the problem and move on. Every day hurts us in the election. There is no way that Republicans benefit from the continuation of this discussion. There's no way Republicans benefit from individual Republicans saying, well, I've got the solution. Or I just talked to some guy who was Jimmy Carter's FDIC director, and he has the solution. Unfortunately, that guy is not the President of the United States, not the person the President of the United States asked to be the Secretary of the Treasury, not our nominee for President, not even their nominee for President. Now, you know, part of our problem here with our members is they call the one guy they know in the financial world who says, well, really, all you have to do is this. And that is the biggest enemy we have in getting people to do what is the only option, what's the real option out there to do. I said, well, no, that's not really what you need to do. All you really need to do is this. Well, that would be fine if that guy was the guy in charge. But that guy's not the guy. Whoever that guy was is not the guy in charge. And it's probably not nearly as simple as that person thinks it is. In fact, often that person's not nearly as sophisticated as the member of Congress who's talking to him thinks they are. This is a big, complex, worldwide problem, and it's hurting us. It's hurting the country, more importantly, but there's no question that, 10 days ago, like a week ago Monday, I was feeling so good about the McCain campaign and the congressional elections. I still think there's time to get back to where we need to be, but I don't feel nearly as good as I did 10 days ago, all because of this discussion. You had your hand up the longest. There's the mic. There's the mic.
Congratulations on terminating the moratorium on oil shale development, which has 8 times as much oil as Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
And it
right.
terminated within the last 24 hours. What are the probabilities that you can keep that from being reinstalled in the coming months? And if it is reinstalled, will people who have leased federal lands be prohibited then from carrying out the development?
Okay, the oil shale and outer continental shelf issue is huge. We've known for a long time that we were the Saudi Arabia of coal. But at $68 a barrel or up, we're actually also the Saudi Arabia of oil. And as our friend just mentioned, the 800 billion barrels of retrievable oil shale at, again, $68 a barrel or up, retrievable at that level, is more than twice the reserves of Saudi Arabia and harder to retrieve. We think we have, the estimates are up to 4 trillion barrels of oil shale oil. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to be doing everything we can to find the next thing out there to drive, to power the economy, but you wouldn't want to be there, you wouldn't want to get to that next thing in 10 years, even if you could. The economic cost of that transition to jobs, competition, employment, way too much. We need to be figuring out how we find more, use less. There's nothing wrong with using less. Find more, use less, and invest in the future to the point that there is a post-fossil fuel economy, but you don't need to rush to that economy. You just need to you need to know that that's the economy you're headed toward in this transition. What else? You're the man with the mic. You're going to have to decide. Okay, you get to decide who talks, I guess.
Okay.
Massaging your crystal ball,
Yes.
what are your predictions how this chaos and economic problem we now have is going to affect the picture of Congress after the election?
You know, Congress after the election, I also failed to answer the second part of your question. I need to come back to quickly. Whether we continue this victory in eliminating these moratorium on oil shale is all about the presidential election. The president can still, by executive order, stop these things from happening. President Obama would. President McCain would not. So, now, the effect on the election, I think it all depends on whether we're still talking about this topic 4 weeks from now, or even 2 weeks from now. We have to move on. We have to start talking about who is better ready to lead the country. We have to get back to a discussion about national security, good tax policy, the right kind of health care policy. And if we get there, I think we still have a real opportunity. If we don't get there, I don't think we have a real opportunity. Okay, go all the way to the back and then come over here with your mic next time.
Thank you. What is the consequence of this 2/3 of $1 trillion workout, bailout, whatever you call it, toward the deficit and toward consequently printing money and inflation and so forth? And what would you say to the libertarian segment of the conservative movement whose shift in 2006 cost the Republicans control of the Congress, that sometimes the free market has to be allowed to run its course, painful though that might be, in order to remain a truly free market?
Right. All right. Now come back over here. We're going to have 2 or 3 questions over here, then I'm going to have to go. So bring your mic back over here. Oh, you got one here? Okay, I'm sorry. I thought we were dealing one mic. All right. First of all, a lot of this problem is caused by the fact that the circumstances are not truly free market in nature. When every day, every financial institution has to say to the world, because of government regulation, what their current book of assets is worth, that moment, not on a 365-day rolling average or anything that would make sense, but that moment, the government has gone in and created, to a great extent, this problem. Eliminating the significant areas of the mark-to-market reporting will be helpful. That takes a government action, by the way. The long-term cost to the deficit or the debt, this wouldn't be reflecting the deficit at all short-term. In the debt, there's no reason to have long-term debt or deficit consequences. It all depends on whether or not the government is able to go in and truly establish the floor value, the bottom line value of those assets, rather than go in at some higher level. If you really can establish the floor, people will not lose any money. The economy will stabilize. There'll still be some rocky moments. As John McCain would say, my friends, there are still going to be banks that fail in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And all those will have some consequence. But if you can get back to where this is a sort of a rumbling along, it's not going to be smooth, but if you can get it where it's just rumbling along, I think the economy generally takes care of itself as people get back. They're able to borrow money. They're able to do things. Now, how does any of that work if you have ongoing terrible tax policy? It's sort of the unreported story of the economic problems is, and I've said this many times, and Mort's heard me say it many times, you can't spend 20 months talking about how you're going to take every pro-growth tax policy off the books again and expect that not to have economic consequences. People will not make the same decisions when you tell them in 24 months from now the capital gains rate could potentially double and is definitely going to go up. They don't do the same things they would do if they knew that 24 months from now the capital gains rate was still going to be 15%. That's had big impact, and you know, I think an Obama presidency has huge problems for the economy if it happens. So, okay, we're going to do two over here, and then I'm going to have to go. You're going to have to decide. This is of the always crown the queen, never choose the queen genre of politics. You decide who gets to ask the question.
I want to thank you for your service in the United States Congress. I know it's a 24/7 job. My wife is a tax managing CPA, and on the night that Bush made his announcement to give Mr. Paulson $700 billion, she said exactly what you said, that if you change the mark-to-market rules and also increase the FDIC, that would take care of a lot of this situation. My question is, as George Will said it last Sunday, we're about to essentially nationalize our national financial sector, which is one of the largest sectors in American society. Some president, starts with an R, once said that government is often the problem and almost never the solution. Could you explain to us why this is an exception to that wonderful rule?
I think part of the reason that there is a short-term, at least, exception to that rule is the lack of confidence has been created by people saying, the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Treasury first among them, that you have reason not to have confidence in the system. You know, when those people who hold those two jobs are out there telling the American people that the economy is in dire trouble without some government action, it's hard to turn that around. So one last question. I'm feeling bad about you not getting the last question.
Since the
on Sarah Palin.
All right, okay.
since most people feel that, or most conservatives feel that it's the relaxed credit provisions for social purposes to gain votes since Carter, which has brought us to the point that we are at today, what's the likelihood that the workout is going to be able to reverse some of that, or that it may be reversed in the near future?
I think you have to reverse some of that, and I think we've now seen the consequences of that. You know, when you go back to, if you accept the Jimmy Carter premise, obviously there was lots of bipartisan blame from that moment to this moment to get us there. The alternative to where we are right now is much more money to groups like these housing groups like ACORN that would essentially go in and hold over the heads of every financial institution. If you don't make more money available to low-income, poor credit customers, we'll make it impossible for you to get a new location. We'll make it impossible for you to do any kind of merger. We will tie you up so long. This is sort of the Rainbow Coalition view of politics. Last comment, Sarah Palin. You know, I was intending to go to St. Louis tomorrow. I think now I will not. But I think she has a personality, Reagan-like in nature in terms of connecting with people, that I'm actually pretty confident that she's going to do so much better than people anticipate, just as she did at her convention speech. I'm also, I'd love for Joe Biden to say once again, in 1929, when Franklin Roosevelt was president and the stock market crashed, he went on television and explained to the American people what the problem was. Can you imagine if Sarah Palin would have said that? Can you imagine what the reaction would have been? And so we'll see, but I don't think we're quite as disadvantaged in this debate as others, media particularly, would like to say we are, which is actually probably helpful to us that they're saying what they're saying. Thanks for what you do for the Leadership Institute.
Thank you so much. Roy, before you leave, let me make a little presentation. One of the Leadership Institute's Adam Smith ties.
All right, I'm pleased to have you, Madam. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I have lunch most Thursdays at the Wyrick Luncheon, and Congressman Blunt is there every time, and I have to tell you, he is a remarkable man, and we are very fortunate that he is in the position he is in. And when I heard that he was the principal negotiator for the House Republicans, I knew that in this tough situation, we had a really good person there working and negotiating and deciding. I invite you all to come join us next month, Wednesday, November 5th.